Nora Holloway slammed both hands flat on the sheriff's desk and looked Dale Pruitt dead in the eye. "You are not auctioning me off like a broken plow," she said, her voice steady, even as her whole body shook. "I am a human being." Dale didn't blink. He leaned back in his chair, laced his fingers across his chest, and said, "Then act like one Mrs. Holloway and sign the paper. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next will break your heart before it heals it." The morning they buried Thomas Holloway, the town of Red Hollow gave his widow exactly 3 days of grace. On the fourth morning, Sheriff Dale Pruitt arrived at the boarding house on Sycamore Street, knocked twice, and didn't wait for an answer before pushing the door open. Nora was sitting at the small table near the window, hands wrapped around a tin cup that had gone cold, staring at nothing. She hadn't slept. She hadn't eaten since the funeral biscuits Mrs. Crane had pressed into her hands 2 days ago out of pity more than kindness. Dale pulled out the chair across from her without asking and sat down heavily. He was a broad man, not tall, with a sheriff's badge that caught the weak morning light and threw it across the ceiling like a taunt. "Mrs. Holloway," he said. "Sheriff, you know why I'm here." She set the tin cup down very carefully, as though the table might shatter if she wasn't gentle with it. "Thomas's debts. $314, Dale said. "Owed to the bank, to Harlow's feed, and to 2 private individuals whose patience is running thin. The boarding house is included in the calculation. Mrs. Marin wants you out by end of week." Nora said nothing. Outside, she could hear the ordinary sounds of Red Hollow waking up a horse, a hammer somewhere, a child's laugh cutting sharp and clean through the cold air. The world had absolutely no interest in her grief. "You have $2.30, Dale continued. He said it without cruelty, which was almost worse. Just a man reading facts. "I checked with Thomas's account at the bank before I came. $2.30 is what remains." "I'm aware of what remains," Nora said. "Then you're aware you have no options." She looked at him then. She was 26 years old, and she had been pretty once before the years of bad harvests, and a husband who drank his sorrows heavier than he drank his coffee had settled into her bones and her body both. She was a big woman, had always been, even as a girl, wide through the hips and shoulders, soft in the places that hunger hadn't yet reached. The dress she wore was gray-mended twice at the collar, and she wore it like armor because it was the only thing she had left that was entirely hers. "There are always options," she said. "Not for a woman alone in Red Hollow with $2.30, Dale said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, set it on the table between them. "There is one arrangement available to you. I'll be plain about it." She didn't touch the paper. "Be plain. Elias Mercer needs a wife." The name landed in the room like a stone, dropped in still water. Nora had heard of Elias Mercer, the way everyone in Red Hollow had, in fragments, in lowered voices, in the particular silence that fell when someone mentioned the big ranch out past Miller Creek. A rancher who'd had a riding accident 2 years back. A crippled leg, a bitter disposition, a hired hand situation that had apparently gone badly, and a cousin named Wade who managed the books and most of the decisions. "Elias Mercer," she repeated. "He's a fair man," Dale said in the tone of a man who was not entirely sure that was true, but needed it to be. "Good land. The ranch runs 300 head. He needs someone to manage the house, the records, the day-to-day. His leg doesn't allow him the mobility it once did, and Wade's been stretched thin handling the business side." "You want me to marry a man I've never met," Nora said. "Because he needs a housekeeper, he doesn't have to pay. I want you to have a roof over your head and food in your stomach," Dale said, and his voice hardened just slightly at the edges, the way men's voices do when they've decided that their version of help is the only version available. "The arrangement is legal. It's proper. Reverend Hicks would officiate. You'd have the protection of the Mercer name. And what does Elias Mercer get? A capable woman. Dale glanced at her not unkindly, but with the assessing look of a man who had already made his calculations. Someone to keep the house right, see to correspondence, maybe see to his leg. I understand you have some nursing knowledge from your mother's time. Nora's mother had been a midwife in 3 counties. Nora had learned to set bones before she learned to read. She said nothing about that now. Does Mr. Mercer know about this arrangement? She asked. Something shifted in Dale's expression. Just briefly. He's been informed of the situation. That's not what I asked. A pause. He's agreed to meet with you. Agreed to meet, she said. Not agreed to marry. Mrs. Holloway. Dale leaned forward, put both forearms on the table, and looked at her with the plain-faced authority of a man who had closed harder conversations than this one. I am trying to help you. Red Hollow is a small town. You have no family within 200 miles. You have no trade beyond domestic skill, and you have $2.30. In 3 days, you will have nowhere to sleep. Now I can drive you out to the Mercer Ranch this afternoon, or I can drive you to the county line tomorrow morning. Those are the choices I have to offer you. I am sorry they are not better ones. The silence stretched between them. Nora looked down at the folded paper on the table. She didn't pick it up. I'd like an hour, she said. You have it. Dale left, and she sat alone with the cold cup and the thin morning light and the sound of Red Hollow going about its business, and she made the only decision available to a woman who had nothing and intended to survive it anyway. She signed the paper at 11 o'clock. At 12:30, she climbed into Dale's wagon with a canvas bag that held everything she owned. The gray dress she was wearing. One other dress of dark brown wool, her mother's medical kit wrapped in oilcloth, a Bible with her name written on the inside cover, and a small tin box that contained 3 letters from her sister in Ohio, and a lock of hair from the child she and Thomas had lost in the 2nd year of their marriage. She did not look back at the boarding house on Sycamore Street. There was nothing there worth turning around for. The road to the Mercer Ranch ran east from town for 6 miles before it bent north along Miller Creek, and Dale drove it without speaking, which suited Nora fine. She watched the land change as the town fell away, the scrub and hardpan giving way to longer grass, the sky opening up enormous and pale and indifferent above the flat line of the hills. It was cold for October, a dry cold that bit at the ears and the knuckles. She was thinking about the ledgers, not because she'd seen them yet, she hadn't, but because Dale had mentioned that Elias's cousin Wade managed the books, and something in the careful way Dale had said it, like a man stepping around a floor he wasn't sure would hold, had lodged itself in her mind and wouldn't move. Thomas had let other men manage his money too. She knew what the consequences of that could look like. The ranch appeared as the wagon crested a low rise. A main house of weathered timber, 2 barns, a series of outbuildings, and beyond them, the long flat sweep of grazing land with the creek line dark in the middle distance. It was bigger than she'd expected. Well kept in the bones, though she could see from the wagon that the kind of regular attention that keeps a place tight had slipped in recent months. A fence post listing sideways here. A gate hinge that needed oil there. The small accumulated failures of a property run by someone who wasn't giving it his full attention. Dale pulled the wagon up before the main house and climbed down, and Nora climbed down herself without waiting for his hand. She stood in the yard and looked at the front door, and the front door looked back at her closed and not particularly welcoming. Then it opened. The man who came out onto the porch moved carefully with a deliberateness that spoke less of slowness than of pain managed into habit. He was tall, would have been taller if he hadn't been compensating for the bad leg, which he carried slightly hitched at the hip, leaning on a plain wooden cane. He was somewhere in his middle 30s, dark-haired with a weathered face that had been good-looking before the last 2 years had worked it over. He wore a clean shirt, which surprised her. She had expected a man who'd stopped bothering. He stopped at the edge of the porch and looked at her. Not in the way that men in Red Hollow had been looking at her all week, with that mixture of pity and dismissal that she'd come to recognize like a weather pattern. He looked at her straight. Like a man taking a measurement, he intended to be accurate. "Mrs. Holloway," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected and steadier. "Mr. Mercer," she said. A silence. Dale shifted his weight on the wagon seat behind her, the leather creaking. "I appreciate you making the drive," Elias said. He said it like he meant it, which was strange. Most men in difficult situations retreated into formality. He sounded like a man who had decided at some point to just say the true thing and be done with it. "I didn't have a great many alternatives," Nora said. "No?" he agreed. "I don't suppose you did." He looked at Dale. "You can head back, Dale. I'll see to it from here." Dale hesitated. The hesitation of a man who had arranged something and was now uncertain whether it had been wise. And then he clicked to the horse and turned the wagon, and the sound of wheels on frozen ground faded behind her, and Nora was alone with a man she'd married on paper 2 hours ago and had never spoken to before this moment. "You want to come in?" Elias said. It wasn't quite a question. "I do," she said. The interior of the house was clean, which surprised her again. Not a woman's clean, not the kind of ordered, softened cleanliness that came from someone who loved a space, but a man's clean, spare, and functional everything in its place, because placing things correctly was a form of control when other forms had been taken away. A fire burned in the hearth. A table. 4 chairs, though she suspected only one of them got used. A kitchen off to the right and a narrow hallway beyond. On the table, spread open and weighted at the corners with a coffee mug and a folding knife, was a ledger. She looked at it. She couldn't help it. "Sit down, Mrs. Holloway," Elias said, moving to the table and lowering himself into the chair with the careful economy of a man who had learned precisely how to manage a body that had stopped being reliable. "I'd offer you coffee, but I haven't made any yet. I can make some." "I can make it," she said automatically. "You don't need to start proving yourself in the first 5 minutes," he said not unkindly. "Sit." She sat. He was across the table from her, the ledger between them, and he looked at her for a moment with that same straight measurement, and then he said, "I'm going to be honest with you because I think you're a woman who'd prefer that to the alternative." "I would," she said. "This arrangement wasn't my first choice," he said. "I want you to know that because I don't want you thinking you've walked into a situation where someone's grateful for whatever they can get. I'm not a man who does things out of desperation if I can help it." He paused. His jaw tightened slightly the way jaws do when a man is making himself say something he'd rather not. "But my leg isn't improving the way the doctor said it would, and I'm behind on more things than I can keep up with on my own, and Dale—" Another pause. Dale felt this was the practical solution. "And you agreed," she said. "I agreed to meet you," he said carefully. Same answer I gave Dale. Something almost like humor moved in Nora's chest. "He said the same thing to me." Elias looked at her. And then very briefly something that wasn't quite a smile crossed his face, more like the shadow of one, the memory of the expression, rather than the thing itself. "He's a practical man," he said. "He is," she said. "I am too." "I know you are," he said. "I asked about you before I agreed to the meeting. Clara Briggs at the store said you kept Thomas's accounts when things were difficult. Said you had a head for numbers." Thomas had been drunk more often than he'd been sober in the last 3 years of his life, though she didn't say that. "I managed what I could," she said. Elias nodded. He looked down at the open ledger, and she looked at it too, and even from across the table, even without reading the specific columns and figures, she could see something that pulled at the back of her mind like a loose thread. The handwriting changed partway through the page. Not dramatically. A careful man would have meant it not to show, but there. The slant of the 7s. The way the 3s were closed differently. "That's your cousin's work," she said, before she'd fully decided to say it. Elias's eyes came up sharply. "Wade manages the books." "I can see that." She kept her voice neutral. "2 different hands. The earlier entries are yours." A pause. "Before the accident." She nodded and said nothing more. But she had seen it, and she knew she had seen it, and somewhere in the back of her mind, quiet and patient, a question had taken root that she was not yet ready to ask out loud. "The room at the end of the hall is yours," Elias said, closing the ledger. "There's a lock on the door. The key's on the nail inside. I don't go into rooms that aren't mine." "I appreciate that," she said. There'll be a learning period, he said. Neither of us knows the other. I don't expect I'm not... He started again. This is a practical arrangement, Mrs. Holloway. I understand that. I won't make it into something it isn't. Nora, she said. He looked at her. If we're going to be practical, she said, we might as well use names. Another shadow of that almost smile. Elias, he said. She stood up, picked up her canvas bag, and went to find the room at the end of the hall. The key was on the nail, as he'd said. She locked the door behind her, set the bag on the narrow bed, and sat down beside it and put her hands flat on her knees and breathed. $2.30. A husband she'd known for 3 hours. A ledger with 2 different hands. And somewhere in the house the sound of a man moving carefully across a wooden floor carrying a pain she hadn't yet begun to understand. Nora Holloway was not a woman who cried when she was afraid. She was a woman who made lists. She lay back on the narrow bed, stared at the ceiling, and began to make her list. By the time the light failed and Elias knocked on her door to say supper was on the stove, if she wanted it, the list was very long, and the item at the top of it, the one she kept returning to, the one she couldn't set aside. No matter how many practical things she stacked on top of it, was the ledger open on the table and the 2 different hands, and the question she wasn't yet ready to ask. She got up, smoothed the gray dress, and went to the kitchen. I can cook, she said, standing in the doorway. Elias was at the stove, moving with that careful deliberateness, a wooden spoon in one hand, and the cane set against the counter beside him. He looked over his shoulder. I noticed, he said, but I had it started already. Then I'll set the table, she said. Plates are in the cabinet above the sink, he said. She got the plates. She found the forks. She set 2 places at the table that had clearly only ever had one, and she sat down across from a man who had told her plainly that this was a practical arrangement, and she looked at the closed ledger sitting on the far end of the table, and she decided that practical was exactly the right word. She was going to be very, very practical, and she was going to find out what was wrong with those numbers if it took her the rest of the winter. She learned his routine the way you learn a river, not by standing at the bank and studying it, but by getting in and feeling where the current wanted to take you. Elias woke before dawn. She knew this because she woke before dawn too, a lifelong habit from years of managing a household that started falling apart if she wasn't the first one standing. The first morning she heard him in the kitchen at 5, the low sound of the stove being fed the particular quiet of a man who had learned to move through his own house without making noise either out of consideration or out of the kind of solitude that becomes its own language after long enough. She stayed in her room that first morning. She wasn't ready yet, and she knew the difference between patience and hesitation. Patience was a choice. Hesitation was fear in a dress. And she had decided the night before, lying on that narrow bed with her lists running through her head, that she was not going to be afraid in this house. But she was going to be careful. On the second morning she came out. Elias was at the table with the ledger open and a cup of coffee beside it, and he looked up when she appeared in the doorway with the expression of a man who hadn't quite decided whether her presence was an intrusion or a relief. She didn't give him time to decide. She went to the stove, found the coffee, poured herself a cup, and sat down at the table across from him without asking. Early riser, he said. Always have been, she said. He looked back at the ledger. She looked at the ledger too, and he noticed her looking, and for a moment, neither of them said anything, and then he turned the ledger slightly so she could see the page better. It wasn't an invitation exactly. It was more like a man who had stopped bothering to hide something he was already tired of carrying alone. The October numbers are off, he said. By how much? She asked. Enough. She pulled the ledgers toward her, and he let her. She ran her finger down the column of figures. Hay grain supplemental feed. Veterinary costs labor, and she felt it before she could name it, the way you feel a lie before you can prove it, a slight wrongness in the weight of things. Do you have the supplier receipts? She asked. Wade keeps those in town, at the office above the feed store. Of course he does, she said, and kept her voice even. Elias looked at her. You see something? I see a question, she said carefully. I'd need the receipts to make it into an answer. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Wade's been with me 12 years. He's family. I know, she said. She pushed the ledger back across the table. I'm not saying anything yet. I'm saying I'd need the receipts. He picked up his coffee cup and drank, and she could see the tension in the line of his shoulders. The particular tension of a man who already knows something is wrong and has been telling himself for months that he doesn't. She recognized it. She had worn it herself in the last years of her marriage when Thomas's accounts stopped making sense and she'd kept finding reasons not to look too hard. I'll think on it, he said. All right, she said. She didn't push. She had learned young that pushing a proud man before he was ready only sent him in the opposite direction. She drank her coffee, and after a while she asked him what needed doing around the house. And he told her, and she went and did it. And that was the second day. By the end of the first week, they had established a rhythm that felt, if not easy, then at least workable. She cooked. He ate. She kept the house. He managed the ranch hands. There were 3 of them, rough-edged and watchful, who eyed her with the particular suspicion that working men reserve for any change in the established order. She ignored the suspicion and learned their names. Holt Creedy and young Pete, who was 19 and had a mother somewhere in Kansas, and ate like he was making up for every meal he'd ever missed. She started working on Elias's leg on the 4th night. It wasn't a romantic thing. It was purely practical. The way she'd approached it, she'd asked him directly standing in the kitchen after supper, while he was trying to get his boot off and not showing how much it was costing him. My mother was a midwife and a healer, she said. I know muscle work. If you'll let me look at what's happening with that leg, I might be able to help you manage the pain better. He'd looked at her with an expression that had several things in it. Pride, suspicion, something that might have been hope if he'd allowed it to be, and he'd said, "It's not pretty." I've seen ugly wounds, she said. I won't pretend otherwise, and I won't be delicate about it. He'd let her look. The injury was old enough to be scarred over a riding accident, he said 2 years back, thrown from a horse when something had spooked it. The leg had broken badly, been set badly, and the muscles around the old break had contracted and knotted in the way that happened when pain wasn't properly managed in the early stages. It wasn't beyond help. It would never be what it had been, but she could see places where the tissue was still fighting to heal, and she knew things her mother had taught her that a frontier doctor likely hadn't tried. This is going to hurt, she told him. Most things do, he said. She worked on his leg for 40 minutes that first night, and he made no sound at all, which told her more about him than anything he'd said in 4 days. A man who'd learned to absorb pain quietly was a man who'd spent a long time doing it without anyone there to witness. When she was done, she showed him the stretching she wanted him to do in the mornings, slow and deliberate, and he listened with the focused attention he gave to everything, and he said, "You think this will make a difference? I think in 6 weeks you'll have a better answer to that than I do," she said. He nodded. And then, because he was Elias Mercer and apparently incapable of leaving a debt unacknowledged, he said, "Thank you, Nora." It was the first time he'd used her name. She felt it land, and she didn't examine why. 12 days and Wade Mercer came to the ranch. She heard the horse before she saw him, and she came to the door because that was what you did. And she saw a man who was somewhere around Elias's age, but carried himself differently, too smooth, too easy in his skin, the way men who've been winning at something for a while tend to carry themselves. He was good-looking, in a calculated way, and he smiled at her with a warmth that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Well?" he said, dismounting and looking her over with an assessment he made no effort to conceal. "So this is the widow Dale found." "Nora Mercer," she said, because the name was legally hers now, and she intended to use it like a tool. "You'd be Wade." "Cousin Wade," he said, and smiled wider. "Elias inside. He's with Holt checking the north fence. He'll be back by noon." Wade looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable, and she met it without moving. Then he swung down from the horse and tied it to the post, and walked past her into the house like a man who'd been doing that his whole life, which he probably had. She followed him in. He went straight to the table. She noticed that. Straight to the table, and his eyes swept across it looking for something she thought or checking on something, and then he sat down and pulled off his hat and smiled at her again. "You're settling in all right." "Just fine," she said. "Elias treating you decently?" "Mr. Mercer is a fair man," she said. Something shifted very slightly in Wade's expression. Not quite displeasure, but a kind of recalibration. She had the sense of a man who had expected something different and was adjusting his approach. "He can be hard to know," Wade said. "Don't take it personally if he goes cold on you sometimes. It's just his way." "I don't take things personally when they're not personal," she said. Wade laughed an easy, practiced laugh. "I like you," he said. She said nothing and went to pour him coffee because that was the polite thing to do, and while she stood at the stove with her back to him, she heard the very faint sound of paper moving. She turned around. Wade had his hands flat on the table, the coffee cup in front of him, the ledger closed beside him. He was looking at her pleasantly. The ledger had been open when she'd left it. She set the coffee down in front of him without showing anything in her face, and she sat across from him, and they talked about the weather and the fall grazing and the price of cattle, and she was charming and easy and laughed at the right moments. And all the while she was thinking about that closed ledger and what he'd been looking for in the 30 seconds she'd had her back turned. Elias came in at noon, moving through the door with his cane and stopping when he saw Wade at the table. Something moved across his face. Not pleasure exactly, but the complicated expression of a man who loves his family and suspects them at the same time and hasn't yet resolved which feeling wins. "Wade," he said. "Elias." Wade stood, and the cousins gripped hands. Not a warm greeting, she noticed, not backslapping or grinning, but something more deliberate. "Came to go over the November projections." "I thought we were doing that Friday," Elias said. "Changed my schedule. Figured I'd come out." Wade glanced at Nora. "Your wife made me feel very welcome." Elias looked at her. She kept her expression easy and pleasant, and gave him nothing, because she didn't have enough yet to give him anything, and a half-built case was more dangerous than no case at all. He'd just end up defending Wade and pushing her away, and she'd lose the access to those ledgers she was only just beginning to earn. "I'll leave you two to the business," she said, and went to the kitchen, and she was very quiet, and she heard almost everything. What she heard was not a smoking gun. It was subtler than that, and more troubling, the sound of a man steering a conversation expertly and carefully away from every number that might invite scrutiny. Wade moved through the November projections the way a card sharp moves through a hand, fast and smooth and confident, giving Elias just enough information to feel involved, and not enough to see the whole picture. She'd seen it before. Thomas had let men do it to him for years. She'd watched him nod along, thinking he understood, while the real information happened somewhere else. That evening, after Wade had ridden out, Elias sat at the table, and she brought supper, and they ate for a while without speaking, and then she said carefully, "Does Wade keep a separate set of records in town?" Elias set down his fork. "What do you mean?" "The ledger here only goes back 6 months," she said. "For a ranch this size, there should be 2 years of records, maybe more. I'm wondering where the older books are kept." He was quiet. She could feel him making a decision whether to defend Wade reflexively, the way men defended the people they'd chosen to trust, or whether to hear the question she was actually asking. "He keeps the business records at the office above Harlow's," he said finally. "Would he mind if you asked to see them?" Another silence. Longer this time. "He might wonder why I was asking," Elias said. "Well," she said, and picked up her fork again. "That would tell you something, too." He looked at her across the table, and she could see him working through it. The pride of a man who didn't like admitting he might have been made a fool of, and the intelligence of a man who was beginning to understand that the cost of not admitting it was higher than the cost of pride. "How long have you suspected?" he asked. "I've been asking questions," she said. "I haven't suspected anything yet." It was technically true. What she had was not suspicion. What she had was the weight of 2 different handwriting styles and a man who'd closed a ledger she hadn't closed, and 12 years' worth of Wade's name attached to every financial decision on this ranch, and a gut-deep certainty that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with having watched up close what long-term betrayal looks like in a set of numbers. She didn't tell him any of that. She said, "I think you should ask to see the older books, that's all." He said nothing. He finished his supper. He went to bed. She sat at the table alone with the current ledger and a pencil and a piece of paper, and she started making a different kind of list. Not the list of things she needed to do to survive. That list was handled. She was fed, she was housed, she was learning the ranch, and she was slowly and carefully building something with Elias Mercer that she hadn't expected to build. Not love, not yet, not anything she was willing to name, but a mutual recognition, the kind that develops between two people who are both accustomed to reading a room and who have begun to realize the other one is doing the same thing. This was a different list. This was a list of numbers that didn't reconcile, of purchase entries that seemed high for the quantities recorded, of dates that didn't line up with the seasonal rhythms of a cattle operation the way they should. Small things, individual things, the kind of things that a man running a ranch alone in pain might not notice. She noticed. She worked until the lamp burned low, and then she put the paper away in her mother's medical kit, the one place she was certain Wade would never think to look, and she went to bed, and in the dark she lay with her eyes open and thought about a man who managed his cousin's books, and knew where every record was kept, and had been doing this, she was now almost certain, for at least 2 years. Since the accident. Since Elias had stopped being able to watch things himself. She turned onto her side and stared at the wall, and thought about that, about the timing, about what it meant, about whether the accident itself had been entirely what everyone believed it to be. And then she told herself, that was too far. That was the kind of leap you made when you were already sure, and she wasn't sure yet. She needed more. She needed the other records. She needed Clara Briggs at the feed store, who apparently had a head for what moved through that town and when. Tomorrow, she decided. Tomorrow she would ask Elias to take her into town. She'd say she needed things from the store. It was even true. And while she was at the store, she was going to have a very careful conversation with Clara Briggs. She closed her eyes. Outside, the wind moved across the flat land, and the ranch was quiet. And somewhere at the other end of the hall, she could hear nothing at all. And she thought about a man who'd learned to make no noise when he was hurting. And she wondered how long he'd been doing that. And she thought that whatever she found in those records, she was going to have to be very careful with how she told him. Because some truths she knew had to be delivered like medicine, in the right dose at the right time, or they didn't heal anything. They just caused more damage. She asked him at breakfast. She set the plate in front of him, egg salt pork biscuit she'd made from the last of the flour, and had already added to her mental list for the store, and she sat down across from him and said without preamble, "I need to go into town today. I'd like it if you came with me." Elias looked up from his plate. "Something you need?" "Flour, thread, a few other things." She picked up her coffee. "And I'd like to meet Clara Briggs properly. She was kind enough to speak well of me to you before we met. I'd like to thank her." He watched her for a moment with those steady eyes that didn't miss much. "That's the whole reason. It's the reason I'm saying out loud," she said. "A beat." Then something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite the smile. Never quite the smile, but the territory adjacent to it that she was beginning to know. "Fair enough," he said. "Pete can handle the morning feed. We'll go after." The wagon ride into Red Hollow took 40 minutes, and they spent most of it in the comfortable quiet that had become their default. Not the silence of two strangers with nothing to say, but the silence of two people who had decided that words were for when they meant something. She watched the land. He drove. Once on a rut in the road, his bad leg took a jolt, and she heard the breath he pulled in through his teeth, controlled and brief, and she said nothing, because she knew he didn't want her to, and that was its own kind of respect. Red Hollow, on a Tuesday morning, was modest in its activity. A few horses at the rail outside the saloon, a woman she didn't know hanging wash on a line above the dry goods, 2 men talking outside the bank, with the particular posture of men who were talking about money. Elias guided the wagon to the rail in front of Harlow's feed and tied up, and she noticed without commenting that he positioned the wagon so he could step down on the right side, keeping the bad leg from bearing the drop. She climbed down her side and waited on the boardwalk, and he came around and they went into the store together. Clara Briggs was behind the counter, and she was not what Nora had expected. She had pictured someone soft, matronly, the kind of woman who was kind because it cost her nothing. Clara was none of that. She was around 40, sharp-faced, with quick, dark eyes that inventoried Nora in about 3 seconds, and apparently came up with an answer she could work with because she came around the counter with her hand extended and said, "Mrs. Mercer, I was wondering when I'd see you." "Nora," she said, taking the hand. The grip was firm. "I wanted to thank you for what you said to Elias." "I said the truth," Clara said with the brisk directness of a woman who didn't bother with the other kind. "You ran Thomas Holloway's accounts when he couldn't, and you kept that household standing longer than anyone expected. That's worth saying." She glanced at Elias. "Elias, leg looking better." "It is better," he said. And it was true. She had noticed it herself, a fraction, less hitch in his stride, the cane touching down with slightly less necessity. 6 weeks, she'd told him. They were 2.5 in. "I'll get your list," Clara said to Nora, "and leave you two to pretend you came in for flour." Elias made a sound that might have been a cough or a laugh, and went to look at some rope hanging on the far wall, and Nora moved closer to the counter and lowered her voice. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to tell me if it's not something you're comfortable answering." Clara looked at her steadily. "Ask. Wade Mercer, how often does he come in to settle the ranch accounts?" Something moved in Clara's expression, quick and controlled like a card player adjusting a hand. "Monthly. Sometimes more." "Does he pay in cash or against credit?" "Cash," Clara said. "Always cash, which isn't unusual for ranch supply, but—" She stopped. "But—" Nora said quietly. Clara leaned on the counter and her voice dropped to match Nora's. "The amounts he pays don't always match what I'd expect for the quantities he orders. Sometimes he pays more than the invoice. Sometimes he presents an invoice I don't remember writing. I do the books here, Mrs. Mercer. I know my own handwriting." Nora's pulse hit once hard against her ribs. "Duplicate invoices," she said. "I can't prove it," Clara said immediately. "And I'm not a woman who accuses without proof. But I've thought it, yes, for the better part of a year." "Why didn't you say something?" Clara's jaw tightened. "To who Elias has been out at that ranch barely able to walk, and Wade Mercer is the one who comes to town. You go up against a man like Wade without something solid in your hand, he'll turn it around on you before you finish your sentence." Her eyes were direct and serious. "Do you have something solid?" "I'm building it," Nora said. "I need to see the original invoices from the last 2 years, the ones in Wade's office." Clara was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, "The office above the feed store is unlocked Tuesday afternoons when Harlow takes his dinner. Wade only comes in on Wednesdays and Fridays." Nora looked at her. "You've thought about this." "I've thought about a lot of things," Clara said. "I just didn't have anyone to think with." She straightened up as Elias's bootsteps came back across the floor. "Flowers on the second shelf. I'll get you the thread." Nora stepped back, and Clara moved away, and Elias came to stand beside her with a coil of rope over one arm and the relaxed expression of a man who hadn't heard any of what had just happened. "Find what you needed?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I think I did." They were on the road back to the ranch when he said it. Just flatly into the middle of the quiet, the way he said most things that cost him something to say. "Wade came by last Thursday when you were doing the wash," he said, "while I was with Crady at the south pasture. About an hour." She looked at him. "You didn't mention it." "I'm mentioning it now." His eyes stayed on the road. "He was in the house alone. I know because Mrs. Pete's mother, she sends him food. Sometimes she was passing by, she mentioned seeing his horse tied up and no one in the yard." A pause. "He knows where the ledger is kept." The air between them was very still. "Elias," she said carefully. "Don't," he said. His voice was rough. Not angry at her, she understood that. Angry at the shape of what he was starting to believe. "Just don't explain it to me slowly. Say what you think. She said it. I think he's been taking money from this ranch for at least 2 years. I think he does it through inflated supplier invoices, and I think he keeps copies of the real records somewhere you'd never think to look, because he's family and you wouldn't. I think it started when your accident took you off the daily operation and gave him the opening. She paused. I think he came to the house last Thursday to see if anything had changed, if anything had moved. Because someone new is living here now, and that makes him nervous. The wagon rolled and the land was flat and wide and indifferent on all sides. Elias said nothing for a long time. 12 years, he said finally. The words came out with a weight she felt in her own chest. I know, she said. He was at my father's funeral. He helped me get the ranch on its feet when I first took it over. He wasn't talking to her exactly, she thought. He was talking to the fact of it trying to fit it into a shape that made sense. He visited every week after the accident, brought food, managed everything while I was laid up. That's when it started, she said gently. The access came with the care. That's how it usually works. He turned his head and looked at her, and his face was doing something she hadn't seen it do before. Not breaking, not collapsing, but cracking slightly along lines that had been holding for a very long time. You sound like you've seen this before. I have, she said. Not ranch accounts, but the pattern. He looked back at the road, another long silence. Then, what do you need? Not a question. An offer. She heard the difference. The original invoices from his office, and time to compare them against the current ledger line by line. She hesitated. And I need you to trust me that when I have enough, I'll bring it to you first, before anyone else, no matter what it shows. He thought about it. She watched his profile, the set of his jaw, the way his hands held the reins loose and controlled. A man making a decision about whether to trust a woman he'd known for less than 3 weeks. All right, he said. She went to the office above Harlow's feed the next afternoon. She told Elias she was going into town for threads she'd forgotten. He looked at her with the steady gaze that said he knew she wasn't going for thread, and he said, "Be back before dark," which was the closest he was going to come to saying, "Be careful." Clara unlocked the side door with a key. Nora had not asked her how she'd obtained. They went up the narrow stairs together, and the office was a small, close room with a desk, 2 filing boxes, and a shelf of bound ledgers that went back 6 years. Nora went straight to the ledgers. She had 2 hours. She worked with the focus she'd learned from years of managing a household on a shrinking income total. Concentration, no wasted motion. Everything noted on the sheets of paper she'd brought folded in her coat. Clara stood near the door and kept watch, and neither of them spoke except when Nora said a number and Clara confirmed it or didn't. At 40 minutes in, she found the first one. An invoice from the spring of the previous year hay supply listed in the ranch ledger as $42. The original invoice from the supplier, $27. $15 missing. 1 line. She wrote it down. At 55 minutes, she found 3 more like it. Different suppliers, different months. The same pattern, the original invoice, significantly lower than what had been recorded in the ranch books. At 1 hour and 10 minutes, she found something that stopped her breath entirely. It was not an invoice. It was a letter folded small and tucked into the back cover of the ledger from 2 years ago, and it was in a handwriting she didn't recognize, and it said, "Mercer won't be a problem much longer. The horse is already managed. Your window starts when he's off his feet." She read it twice. Her hands were completely steady. The rest of her was not. "Clara," she said. Clara crossed the room and read it over her shoulder. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "That's not about financial records," Clara said quietly. "No," Nora said. "It's not." She copied the letter word for word onto her paper, then replaced it exactly as she'd found it. Her mind was moving very fast and very cold, the way it did when something shifted from difficult to dangerous. The accident 2 years ago. The horse that had thrown Elias. The timing of Wade's access to the ranch accounts. She had thought it was opportunism, a man who saw an opening and took it. She had not considered that the opening might have been made deliberately. She folded her papers back into her coat and looked at Clara. "This doesn't leave this room yet," she said. "Not until I know exactly what we have and what to do with it." "Agreed," Clara said. "But Nora?" Her voice was serious. "If that letter means what I think it means, this isn't just embezzlement." "I know what it means," Nora said. "Then you need to be careful who else knows you've seen it. Because Wade Mercer has lived in this town his whole life. He's got people here." "I know that too," she said. They went back down the stairs, and Clara locked the door behind them, and Nora walked to her wagon in the early afternoon light with her papers pressed flat against her side, under her coat. And she drove back to the ranch with 12 separate documented discrepancies and one letter that changed everything. And the whole drive home, she was running it through her head, over and over, how to use it, when to use it. How to tell a man that the cousin who'd sat by his bed and managed his ranch and brought him food while he healed might have been the reason he needed healing in the first place. Elias was on the porch when she pulled up. He'd been waiting. She could see it in the way he was standing, not casually, not passing time, but the specific stillness of a man who had been standing in one place because moving would have meant admitting how much he was worried. She climbed down from the wagon and went up to the porch and stopped in front of him, and she looked at him directly, and she said, "I need to show you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you say anything." He looked at her face, and whatever he saw there was enough, because he said, "Come inside," and held the door. She spread her papers on the table. She walked him through the 12 discrepancies, calm, methodical, number by number, and she watched his face do the thing a man's face does when what he's hearing confirms something he'd been hoping wasn't true. He didn't interrupt. He'd said he'd hear all of it, and he did. And when she was done with the numbers, she paused. "There's something else," she said. She slid the copied letter across the table. He read it. Once. Then again. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she'd heard since she'd arrived at the Mercer Ranch. She watched him very carefully because she'd thought a great deal on the ride home about what this moment would do to him. A proud, private man discovering that his injury had not been an accident, that the cousin he'd trusted for 12 years had possibly engineered the moment that had broken his body and his confidence and 2 years of his life. When he looked up, his face was very still, and his voice, when it came, was almost perfectly controlled. Almost. "Where did you find this?" he said. "In the office above the feed store," she said. "Filed in the back of the ledger from 2 years ago. Someone kept it. I don't know if it was carelessness or—" She stopped. "Or confidence that no one would ever look." "No one ever did," he said. He looked down at the letter again. "Until you." She didn't say anything. This was not the moment for words. This was the moment for letting a man sit with something that had broken him open all over again, and not trying to fix the breaking, because some things had to break before they could be properly repaired. After a long time he said, "I need to think." "I know," she said. "Don't—" He stopped. Started again. "Don't do anything with this yet. Don't tell anyone. Give me a day." "You have it," she said. She gathered the papers and went to her room, and she sat on the edge of the narrow bed and let her own hands shake now that there was no one to see them, because she was not made of stone, whatever her face said. Outside the window, the ranch was going about its evening business, Holt calling something to young Pete, the horses moving in the paddock, the ordinary sounds of a place that had no idea yet that everything inside it was about to change. One day, she thought. She'd given him one day. And then they were going to have to decide together what to do with the truth she'd pulled out of the dark. He didn't sleep. She knew because she didn't sleep either, and the house had a particular quality of silence when both people in it were lying awake in separate rooms carrying the same weight. At some point past midnight, she heard him get up. The careful footsteps, the cane, the creak of the kitchen floorboard that always announced him. She lay in the dark and listened to the sound of a man trying to think his way through something that couldn't be thought through. It had to be felt first, and men like Elias Mercer did not feel things easily or quickly. They sat with them in the dark and turned them over and over until the sharp edges wore down enough to be held. She got up at 4:30 and went to the kitchen. He was at the table with the copied letter in front of him and both hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, and he looked up when she came in, and his face had the particular hollowness of a man who had been somewhere very far and come back. She went to the stove and built the fire up and put fresh coffee on and didn't say anything, and he didn't say anything. And when the coffee was ready, she poured 2 cups and set one in front of him and took the old one away and sat down. After a while he said, "I remember the horse." She waited. He was a good horse, steady. I'd had him 4 years. He didn't spook easy. His voice was very flat and controlled the way it got when he was managing something large underneath it. That morning, the morning of the accident, he was different, nervous. I thought it was something in the air, a predator scent maybe. I didn't think. He stopped. I didn't think someone had gotten to him first. "You couldn't have known," she said. "I should have." His jaw tightened. "It's my ranch, my horse, my—" He stopped again, and she could see him pulling himself back from the edge of something that would cost him more than he wanted to spend right now. 12 years, Nora." "I know," she said. He sat in that chair. He looked at the chair beside the window, and she understood he meant during the recovery, the weeks he'd been laid up. "He sat in that chair, and he told me the ranch was in good hands, that I should rest, that he'd handle everything." The laugh that came out of him was not a laugh at all. It was the sound of a man recognizing the shape of his own humiliation. "He handled everything all right." She let the silence hold for a moment. Then, "What do you want to do?" He looked at her. "What are my options?" "We take the evidence to Dale Pewitt," she said. "The invoice discrepancies are documented and provable. The letter is—" She paused. "The letter is harder. We don't have a signature. We don't know who wrote it to whom. A good lawyer could argue Wade never sent or received it. But it was in his file. It was in a file in an office he uses. He'll say he never saw it. He'll say someone else put it there." She kept her voice even, because this was the part that mattered, the part where emotion had to step aside and let strategy do the work. "The embezzlement case is solid. The 12 discrepancies, Clara's testimony about invoices, she didn't write the 2 different handwriting styles in the ledger, that's enough to bring charges. The letter," she looked at it. "The letter is enough to make him afraid." Elias went very still. "You want to use it as leverage." "I want to use it as truth," she said. "Which it is, but the way we use truth matters." She met his eyes directly. "If we go to Dale with everything at once, Wade will lawyer up within the hour. He has money, your money, and he has connections in this town. He's lived here his whole life. We need him off balance before he has a chance to build a defense." "You've thought about this a great deal," he said. "I've thought about nothing else for 2 days, she said. He was quiet, looking at her across the table. "When Thomas Holloway was alive," he said slowly, "did he know you could do this?" It was an unexpected question, and it hit her somewhere unguarded. "No," she said. "He didn't." "His loss," Elias said quietly, and looked back at the letter. She let that sit, because she didn't know what to do with it yet, and she needed her head clear. "The confrontation needs to happen somewhere public," she said. "Somewhere Wade can't control the narrative in the moment. The feed store is the natural meeting ground. It's where the business happens. It's where Clara is. It's neutral ground." "You want to call him in for a meeting?" "I want you to call him in for a meeting," she said. "About the November accounts going into December. Routine. He won't suspect anything because he'll think he's managed things well enough that there's nothing to suspect." Elias turned the letter face down on the table deliberately, like a man closing a chapter he needed to stop reading for now. "And you'll be there?" "I'll be there," she said, "with everything documented." He nodded once. "I'll send word to Wade this morning." He sent Pete with the message before breakfast, and they spent the day doing the ordinary things a ranch demanded: feeding, checking the water troughs. Nora going over the household accounts with the precision that had become her daily discipline. And neither of them talked about what was coming, because they had said what needed saying, and now it had to sit and settle before it could be used. At midday, Holt came to the porch with an expression that said he had something he'd been turning over for a while. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, and then stopped. turned his hat in his hands. "Holt," she said, "say it." He looked at her, this big, quiet man who'd worked the Mercer Ranch for 7 years and watched things go sideways without quite knowing why, and had apparently decided that the new woman in the house was the right person to say the next thing to. "Wade Mercer was out here 2 weeks ago while the boss was down the south pasture. I didn't think much of it at the time because he's family, he comes out whenever. But he went into the house, and I know for certain. Sure, Mr. Elias wasn't home, because I'd just ridden in from watching him leave." He turned the hat one more time. "And when Wade came out, he had something under his coat. Flat. Like papers." Nora looked at him steadily. "Did you tell Elias?" "I'm telling you," Holt said, "because you're the one who seems to be doing something about things." "Thank you, Holt," she said. "I mean that." He nodded, jammed the hat back on, and went back to work. She went inside and found Elias in the hall and told him what Holt had said, and she watched his face do the controlled cracking thing again, and then he said very quietly, "He took papers from my house." "Probably the original supplier contracts," she said. "The ones you signed when you set up the ranch accounts. He'd want those before anyone could compare signatures." "He knew," Elias said. "He knew someone was looking. He suspected. He didn't know what we had." She put her hand on his arm the first time she'd touched him anywhere other than his leg in a medical context, and she felt him go very still under her hand, but he didn't pull away. "He still doesn't, and that's our advantage." Wade's reply came back with Pete at supper time. Friday, 11 o'clock, Harlow's feed. He'd written it in that smooth, confident hand, easy and unhurried, the writing of a man who had no idea that the ground had already shifted completely under his feet. Elias read the note and set it down and looked at Nora across the supper table. "Friday," he said. "Friday," she agreed. She spent Thursday with Clara at the store, going over everything one more time. The documented discrepancies laid out in order the testimony Clara was willing to give the original invoices Clara had kept her own copies of, because she was, as she put it, a woman who believed in keeping records of her own work. They organized it into a sequence that built logically irrefutably, the kind of case that didn't require a courtroom to land its force, only an audience and a man who didn't know he was walking into one. "Are you frightened?" Clara asked her at one point. "Yes," Nora said, because she'd learned the difference between fear and weakness, and admitting the first wasn't the second. "Good," Clara said. "Frightened women work carefully. Confident women get sloppy." She looked at the papers spread across the counter. "He's going to be ugly when he sees this." "I know," Nora said. "He has friends in this town. Some of them are going to take his side regardless of what the evidence shows." "I know that too." Clara looked at her directly. "And you're going to do it anyway." "Someone has to," Nora said. "And I'm the one who found it." Thursday night was the longest night she could remember, and she had had some long nights. She went over the documents 3 times in her room by lamplight, looking for any weakness, any gap, any place Wade could insert an explanation that would hold up under pressure. There were none that she could find. The case was clean. The number of discrepancies was large enough that no single one could be dismissed as accounting error, and the pattern over 24 months spoke with the clarity of intention. What she couldn't account for was the letter. She looked at it again, the copy she'd made in her own handwriting. "Mercer won't be a problem much longer. The horse is already managed. Your window starts when he's off his feet." She turned it in her mind the way Elias had turned his coffee cup the night she'd shown it to him. Whoever had written it had known the plan in advance. That meant Wade had not acted alone. There was someone else. Someone who had either suggested the accident or enabled it. She didn't know yet who, and she had decided with the kind of hard, practical clarity that was her strongest gift that she was not going to let the unknown quantity derail the known case. She had what she had. She would use it. The morning of Friday, she was up at 4:30 again, and this time Elias was already in the kitchen, already dressed, the cane in his hand, and his face set with the expression of a man who had finished grieving and had moved into the territory beyond it. The territory that was just resolve. "How's the leg?" she asked, because it was the honest question, and because she needed to know. "Good enough," he said. "I need you to stand the whole time. she said. "If you're sitting when he comes in, he has the height advantage and he'll use it. I've seen men like Wade, they read the room physically before they read it any other way." Elias looked at her for a moment. "I've been managing men like Wade my whole life." "I know," she said. "I'm saying it anyway." Something in his face relaxed fractionally. "All right," he said, standing. They drove to Red Hollow together, and the November morning was hard and cold and bright, and she sat beside him on the wagon seat, with the folder of documents inside her coat against her chest, and her hands in her lap, and her mind very quiet the way it went when things were about to happen that couldn't be undone. "Nora," he said about a mile from town. "Yes. Whatever happens today." He stopped, looked at the road. "You didn't have to do this. You didn't have to look. You didn't have to find it. You could have kept your head down and kept house and let things stay buried." He paused. "Why didn't you?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because buried things don't stay buried," she said. "They just poison the ground above them." She looked at him. "And because this is my ranch too now, for whatever that's worth." He didn't answer that immediately. He drove for a moment in silence, and then he said, "It's worth a great deal." And she looked straight ahead and let that be enough. Clara had Harlow's feed arranged by the time they arrived, the big work table in the middle of the room, cleared chairs on two sides, the counter at the back where Clara stood doing inventory, with the calm efficiency of a woman who was doing something else entirely. 3 townspeople had found reasons to be in the store at 11 on a Friday morning. The banker, Horace Gill, who owed nobody any favors and whose opinion in Red Hollow carried weight. Mrs. Dunmore from the post office, who knew everything and forgot nothing, and old Reverend Hicks, who had married Nora to Elias on paper, and who looked at her now with an expression that said he was still deciding what he thought about her. She nodded to each of them. Witnesses. Not summoned. She hadn't summoned them. She had said nothing to them directly, but Clara had mentioned to each of them separately that there was going to be an accounting meeting at Harlow's on Friday that might be of interest. Clara Briggs was a woman who believed in records. She also believed in audiences. Wade came in at 11:05 with the casual confidence of a man arriving at a meeting he controlled, and he stopped just inside the door when he registered the room. Elias standing at the table, Nora beside him, Clara at the back, and 3 of Red Hollow's most observant citizens, arranged around the edges in the ordinary attitudes of people who were absolutely not watching. Something moved in Wade's eyes, fast, adjusting. He was good. She'd give him that. "Elias," he said, and smiled and came forward. "Didn't know this was a crowd occasion." "Sit down, Wade," Elias said. His voice was very quiet. Wade looked at him, then at Nora, then at the folder she'd set on the table between them. "What's this?" he said. "Sit down," Elias said again. Wade sat. He was still smiling, but the smile had changed quality, thinner, more watchful, a tool being used rather than an expression being felt. Nora opened the folder and set the first page in front of him. "This is the Mercer Ranch ledger entry for hay supply. April of last year," she said. Her voice was clear and even, and she watched his face while she spoke. $42 recorded in your handwriting." She set the second page beside it. "This is the original invoice from the supplier, $27. Sure." Wade looked at both pages. The smile went through another change, smaller, more careful, a man buying himself time. "Accounting error," he said. "These things happen." 12 times, she said, and laid the next page down. "Over 24 months. Another page. With 4 different suppliers. Another. All recorded in your handwriting. Another. All significantly higher than the original invoices, copies of which are held by Clara Briggs, who keeps her own records and will testify to their accuracy." She set the last page down and looked at him across the table and said nothing further, because she had learned from her mother that the most powerful moment in any confrontation was the one where you stop talking and let the silence do the next thing. Wade looked at the pages. He looked at Elias. He looked at Nora. And then he looked at Clara, who looked back at him from behind the counter with the calm, steady gaze of a woman who had been waiting a long time for this particular morning and was not going to look away from it. "This is your wife's doing," Wade said to Elias. His voice had changed, now the warmth completely gone, something harder underneath it, and she could hear in it the shape of a man deciding what version of himself to become in the next 60 seconds. A woman who's been in this county for less than a month going through private business records, making accusations against a man who has given 12 years of his life to this family. "Nobody's making accusations," Elias said. His voice was the same quiet it had been since they'd walked in, and she understood now what that quiet cost him, and why it was the right choice. "The numbers are making them." Wade stood up. He was taller than Elias, and she could see him using it deliberately, straightening to his full height, the physical language of a man reasserting dominance. "I want to talk to you alone," he said to Elias. "Without her, Nora stays," Elias said, flatly, without hesitation. Something cracked in Wade's composure. Not fully, he was too practiced for that, but she saw it. "You're going to take her word over mine. A widow Dale Pewitt saddled you with because nobody else would have her." "Careful," Elias said. One word, quiet as the rest, but it landed in the room like a door slamming. Wade heard it. He stopped. Nora pulled the copied letter from beneath the other documents and laid it on the table. Wade looked at it. She watched the exact moment he recognized it. A fraction of stillness, a breath held, and then released too carefully. And she knew with absolute certainty that he knew exactly what it was, and exactly where it had come from. "I don't know what that is," he said. "Then let me read it to you," she said, and she did word for word in her clear, steady voice, with Horace Gill and Mrs. Dunmore and Reverend Hicks all hearing every syllable, and when she finished the room was so quiet she could hear the horses outside shifting at the rail. Wade looked at her, and for the first time since he'd walked through the door, the mask was fully gone, and what was underneath it was something cold and calculating, and not at all the charming cousin who'd brought food to a man laid up in bed. "You can't prove that letter is connected to me," he said. "Maybe not today," she said. "But it was in your file in your office, in your handwriting on the outside of the ledger it was tucked into. And the man who wrote it to you knew about an accident before it happened." She let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. "Dale Pewitt is going to find that very interesting." The color left Wade Mercer's face. Not gradually. All at once, the way certainty leaves a man when he understands that the ground he thought was solid has been gone for longer than he knew, and the only reason he hadn't fallen yet was that someone else had been holding him up and that someone had just let go. The color didn't come back to Wade Mercer's face. It just stayed gone like a lamp that had been turned all the way down, and what was left in the room was the sound of a man recalculating at speed and finding that every number he tried came out wrong. He looked at the letter. He looked at Nora. He looked at Elias. And then he did the thing she had predicted he would do when she'd lain awake Thursday night running through every possible version of this moment. He turned to the room. He turned to Horace Gill and Mrs. Dunmore and Reverend Hicks, and he spread his hands in the gesture of a reasonable man being treated unreasonably, and he said, "You all know me. You've known me my whole life. You know what kind of man I am." Horace Gill looked at him with the expression of a banker, which was to say an expression that had long since learned to separate the man from the ledger. "I know what kind of man you've presented yourself as," he said. "That's not the same thing." Wade's jaw tightened. Mrs. Dunmore said nothing, which in Red Hollow was its own verdict. Reverend Hicks looked at the papers on the table and then at Wade and said quietly, "Wade, if there's another explanation for these numbers, now is the time to give it." The silence stretched. 5 seconds. 10. Wade said nothing, and his silence was the loudest thing that had happened in that room all morning. Elias moved then. He came around the table, and he moved with more steadiness than she had seen from him since she'd arrived, the cane touching down firm and deliberate, and he stopped in front of Wade and looked at him at close range with the face of a man who had finished the grieving in the dark of his kitchen at 4 in the morning and had nothing left in him now but clarity. "I want the full accounting," Elias said. "Every dollar, every transaction, Every record you moved out of this office and out of my house. You'll bring all of it to Dale Puitt by end of business today, or I will, and what I bring him will include that letter." He paused. "And I will tell him what I believe that letter means. And then it won't just be an embezzlement case." Wade looked at him for a long moment, and she could see it happening in real time. The collapse of 12 years of careful construction, the version of himself he had built and maintained crumbling under the weight of numbers that didn't lie. And a piece of paper that had been waiting in a file for 2 years to be found by the right person. "You can't prove the letter means what you think it means," Wade said, but his voice had lost its shape. It was the voice of a man saying words because silence was worse, not because the words were doing anything useful. "Maybe not yet," Elias said. "But the man who owned that horse before I bought him lives 3 counties over, and I've got a very good memory for names, and I've got a wife who has a very good memory for everything." He didn't look at Nora when he said it, but she felt the weight of the word wife used not as a transactional fact, but as something else entirely. "You want to find out how far back we can pull that thread you keep standing here." Wade picked up his hat from the table. "I want those records by end of day," Elias said. Wade walked to the door, and he stopped with his hand on the frame, and he turned back and he looked at Nora with an expression that had several things in it. Anger and something that might have been a twisted form of respect, and underneath it all the particular bitterness of a man who has been caught not by someone stronger than him, but by someone he had underestimated completely. "You should have stayed in Red Hollow," he said to her, "where you belonged." "I'm exactly where I belong," she said. He left. The door closed behind him, and the room exhaled, and Clara set down the inventory sheet she'd been holding, and pressed both hands flat on the counter, and let out a long, slow breath that said more than any words she might have chosen. Horace Gill stood up and buttoned his coat and looked at Elias. "I'll go with you to Dale's office," he said. "My testimony about the invoice discrepancies will carry some weight. I've reviewed similar cases in county court." "I appreciate that, Horace," Elias said. Mrs. Dunmore crossed the room and stopped in front of Nora, and she looked at her for a moment with eyes that had been watching Red Hollow for 30 years and had seen most of what a small frontier town could produce. "You're Thomas Holloway's widow," she said. "I was," Nora said. "I'm Elias Mercer's wife now." Mrs. Dunmore nodded once slowly, like a woman ratifying something that had been waiting for ratification. "Good," she said, and went out. Reverend Hicks paused beside Nora on his way to the door. "I didn't know what to make of you," he said honestly. "When Dale brought you to me to sign the papers, I thought—" He stopped. "I thought it wasn't a fair arrangement." "It wasn't," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it seems to have become one." He looked at her with the gentle seriousness of a man who had performed enough weddings to know the difference between a legal union and an actual one, and she thought he might be seeing something in her face that she hadn't quite admitted to yet. "God works in practical ways sometimes," he said, and went out after Mrs. Dunmore. Clara came around the counter and stood beside Nora, and they both looked at the documents still spread across the table. "He'll deliver the records," Clara said. "He's too smart not to. The letters scared him, and a scared smart man knows when the cost of fighting is higher than the cost of surrendering." "He'll try to minimize the total," Nora said. "Claim some of it was authorized claim accounting errors on the smaller discrepancies." "Let him," Clara said. "What you've got documented is enough for charges regardless. The rest is for lawyers." She looked at Nora sideways. "You're good at this." "At what?" "At reading the room before the room knows it's being read." Clara began gathering the papers into the folder. Thomas Holloway was a fool not to see it. Nora took the folder from her. "Thomas Holloway had other things occupying his attention," she said, and left it there because the dead deserved at least the dignity of not being fully dissected. Elias was waiting for her by the door, and they went out together into the hard November light, and he stood on the boardwalk for a moment and looked down the street of Red Hollow with the expression of a man seeing his town from a different angle than he had before. Dale Puitt's office was at the far end of the main street, and they walked toward it together, and she noticed without commenting that he wasn't using the cane quite as heavily as he had 3 weeks ago. And she thought that was worth noting, the same way everything was worth noting quietly for later when there was time to examine it properly. Dale looked up when they came in, and his expression went through several things. Quickly, surprise assessment, and then a slow resignation that was almost respect. "Elias," he said. "Mrs. Mercer." He looked at the folder in her hands. "I take it this isn't a social call." "It's not," Elias said. They were in Dale's office for 2 hours. Nora laid out every document, walked him through every discrepancy, and when she placed the copied letter on his desk and read it to him, Dale sat back in his chair and took his hat off and held it in his hands and was quiet for a long moment. "The original horse owner," Dale said finally. "You think he can testify to what the animal was like before Mercer bought him?" "I think it's worth asking," Nora said. "Whether it rises to a criminal charge beyond the embezzlement is for the law to determine. But the letter establishes that the accident was discussed in advance by someone who was in a position to arrange it." Dale looked at Elias. "You understand, this could get complicated. Wade has—" "I know what Wade has," Elias said. "He has my money and 2 years of my life. I'd like them accounted for." Dale nodded slowly. "I'll ride out to Wade's this afternoon. If he doesn't deliver those records voluntarily, I'll bring a deputy." Wade delivered the records. All of them, or close enough to all of them, that the picture they assembled over the following 2 weeks was comprehensive and damning. $341 over 2 years in documented overcharges, plus 2 contracts that had been altered in ways that benefited a supply company whose secondary owner, as Dale Puett discovered after a careful 3-day investigation, was a man named Roy Fetters, who had sold Elias his horse 4 years ago, and who left Red Hollow County very quietly on a Tuesday morning before anyone came to ask him questions. Roy Fetters' departure was, as Dale told Elias, almost as good as a confession. The legal proceedings took 6 weeks and were not dramatic in the way that drama is usually understood. They were the slow, grinding work of documentation reviewed and testimony given, and a judge from the county seat who read everything Nora had compiled with the careful attention of a man who recognized thorough work when it was put in front of him. Wade Mercer was charged with embezzlement and financial fraud. The additional investigation into the accident was ongoing, and the charge connected to it was one that would take longer to build. But it was being built, and that was enough for now. What happened in Red Hollow during those 6 weeks was quieter and in some ways more significant than the legal proceedings. It happened in increments. The way it always does in a small town where no one announces a change in opinion, but everyone shifts simultaneously like a field of grass, all bending the same direction in a wind that no one names. Mrs. Dunmore mentioned to 3 people in the particular careful way she had of mentioning things that Nora Mercer had uncovered 2 years of fraud that had been bleeding the biggest ranch in the county dry, and that she had done it with her own intelligence and her own effort in less than a month. Clara Briggs told her side of the story to anyone who came through the feed store, which was most of Red Hollow, over the course of a week. Horace Gill, who had sat in that room and watched it unfold, said at the bank that in 30 years of finance he had rarely seen bookkeeping work as precise and as courageous as what had been presented at Harlow's feed on that Friday morning. The women of Red Hollow came to the ranch. Not all at once, that would have been too obvious, too organized. They came the way women do when they've made a collective decision, but don't want to appear to have made one together. Mrs. Crane first with a pie and an apology for the brevity of her kindness after Thomas's funeral. Then 2 women from the church, then the wife of one of the ranch hands, then Clara herself on a Sunday afternoon with a bottle of good brandy and the frank declaration that she'd been waiting for a friend like Nora for longer than she cared to say. Nora received them all with the same straightforward courtesy she gave to everything not performing warmth because she wasn't built for performance, but genuinely present, genuinely interested the way she was with anyone who came to her, honestly. Elias watched all of this from the edges of rooms, with the expression she had come to know as his version of satisfaction contained private, the inward recognition of a man who was not surprised that she was worth knowing, but was continually struck by the specific ways in which she proved it. His leg continued to improve. By the 6th week, he was walking a measured distance each morning without the cane, just as she'd shown him, slow and deliberate, working the muscle rather than protecting it. One morning, she came out to the porch and found him standing there, without the cane altogether, looking at the ranch in the early light. And he heard her, and turned, and the expression on his face was not triumph or pride, but something quieter than either of those, the look of a man who had gotten something back that he had not entirely believed he would get back. 6 weeks, he said. 6 weeks, she agreed. They stood there together and looked at the ranch. The barns, the open land, the creek line dark in the distance, the horses moving in the paddock, and it was all the same as it had been when she'd arrived on Dale Pewett's wagon with a canvas bag and $2.30. And it was also entirely different, because the things that had been quietly rotting inside it had been pulled out into the light, and the ground was clean now, and things that grew in clean ground grew straight. It was a Saturday in late December when he said it. They were in the kitchen after supper, the way they always were. Now the natural end of each day that had become its own kind of ceremony. The table, the lamp, the particular quiet of two people who had run out of reasons to be careful with each other and had discovered they didn't miss the careful. He was looking at the table, and then he looked at her, and he said, "This isn't just a practical arrangement anymore." She looked back at him. "No," she said, "it isn't. I don't know how to—" He stopped. The jaw tightened the way it always did when he was making himself say the thing. "I'm not a man who's comfortable saying certain things out loud." "I know," she said, "but I think you should know that when I look at this ranch, I see you in it. Not as—" He paused. "Not as someone I was assigned. As someone who belongs here, who made it what it is again." He looked at her with those steady eyes that didn't miss much and never had. "As someone I would have chosen." The lamp burned between them, and outside the December dark was full and quiet, and the ranch was still. She said, "I would have chosen you too." And then, because she was Nora Holloway Mercer, and she did not do things by halves, she said, "I think I did choose you. The moment I sat down at this table and looked at that ledger and decided I was going to find out what was wrong with it. That was the choice." He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that in the lamplight while the fire burned low, and it was not a dramatic thing, and it was not a grand gesture, and it was exactly right. Spring came to the Mercer Ranch the way spring always did in that country. Not gently, not suddenly, but with the slow insistence of something that had been waiting and knew it had time. The legal case against Wade Mercer concluded in March with a conviction and a restitution order that would take years to satisfy, and the investigation into Roy Fetters continued in the slow, grinding way of frontier law. And Elias walked every morning without a cane on ground that was fully his again. Nora ran the household accounts and the ranch records and trained young Pete to keep a secondary set of books because she believed in redundancy and witnesses. And Clara Briggs became something the town of Red Hollow had not previously witnessed, a formal business partner to the Mercer Ranch, supplying goods at documented contract prices with copies held by all parties, a system so transparent and so well recorded that there was nowhere in it for dishonesty to hide. On a Saturday in April, Elias found her in the orchard where the first buds were showing on the old apple trees, and he came and stood beside her, and she looked up at him. This man who had never asked for a wife, and had gotten one, who came with a canvas bag, and a head for numbers, and a mother's medical kit, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had survived too much to stop now. He was smiling. A full smile, unguarded, the kind she'd glimpsed in fragments over the months and never seen complete until this moment. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I'm just looking at what we built." She looked at the ranch, at the straight fences, and the clean barns, and the horses moving easy in the morning light, and she felt it then, not as a dramatic thing, not as a revelation, but as the solid, simple truth of it that she had come here with nothing, and had built something that was entirely hers, not because anyone had given it to her, but because she had seen what needed doing and had done it one careful day at a time. "We built something good," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and the orchard held them both in the early April light, and the Mercer Ranch stretched out around them, restored and whole and fully alive. A woman they had tried to throw away had saved it, and in doing so, she had also saved herself.